At the age of 16, one frosty English afternoon, C.S. Lewis was boarding a train. While waiting bored at the station, he decided to pick up a book that would change not only his life, but the entire history of the fantasy genre. On his journey, he read, and recalling that fateful train ride says, "That night, my imagination was baptized." The book that he picked up that day was Phantastes by George MacDonald, published in 1858. It's one of the primary influences for Narnia and even Middle-earth. But does it hold up 200 years later, and should you read it? The publication of Phantastes was a bit of an anomaly in 1850. Fantasy in the Victorian age was mostly for children, the Brothers Grimm fairy tales, and the occasional penny dreadful. But still in this time, the Victorian readers were obsessed with the notion of the fae. Not the fae that you might read in current fantasies. A little bit different than that. Phantastes, though, confused readers at the time, critics and general audiences. It was too dreamlike, too abstract, strange, and ambitious. Sales were described as a disappointment. Even George MacDonald himself would move on to simpler children's stories, Christian sermons, and poetry. But it's his first debut novel, Phantastes, that's remembered years later as the beginning of the fantasy genre. And despite the odd circumstances and the time that it was published, Phantastes has many tropes and story beats modern fantasy authors would actually recognize. The story follows a character named Anodos. The opening scenes show him inheriting his father's estate, being visited by a small little fairy, and being transported into a strange new world. Anodos is a lordling's son with wealth and servants and a life of ledgers and rules. It does a decent job at quickly establishing the problem that Anodos has. Despite all of the luxuries that he has, he desires something realer in his life. His father, now dead at the time of the story, was a learned man. With a huge library Anodos visits in the beginning of the story. In that library, as he's searching, Anodos finds a small fairy. The dialogue is pretty charming in my opinion, and the fairy says that Anodos will travel to fairyland that night, saying he must find some hidden truth there. The next morning, Anodos wakes to the sound of rushing water and bird songs. And it's a very cool fantasy scene where he watches his room kind of morph into fairyland. It's not like he enters a door and there he is. No, the world kind of changes around him. The walls drape with vines, water rushes from his floor, and his bed is filled with leaves. The opening is very reminiscent of other famous fantasy openings and kind of feels like a benchmark for portal fantasy. Let's first talk about the world building of the story. It's very different than what a modern reader would expect from a fantasy epic. As Anodos enters fairyland, we see it's not a world of magic systems, political intrigue, or deep lore that you might expect in modern fantasy. Fairyland is intentionally dreamlike and spiritual and not really intended to be realistic or believable. There's a sing-song nature to the prose occasionally that I really enjoyed. It really leads to the whimsical finds that Anodos finds immediately, such as the bantering fairies that live in flowers, or the warm and lovable beech tree that, thinks it's a human. And of course, the marble lady. The fairy introduction is notably good. I really like the banter that they have. There's like 4 or 5 different personalities that they all act kind of in this childish way. They don't take life too seriously, and they kind of laugh at Anodos for doing so. But MacDonald always makes sure that there's always a hint of threat in the background. I think it's this threat that really leads to Phantastes being known as the first true adult fantasy book. Immediately upon entering fairyland, Anodos is warned about these sinister ash trees and how they're kind of sneakily hunting him despite the fact that they don't move. "He does not come nearer than he is now," she replied. "For any of those 4 oaks at the edge of the cottage would tear him to pieces. They are our friends. But he stands there and makes awful faces, stretches out his long arms and fingers, and tries to kill us with fright. For indeed, that is his favorite way of doing. Pray, keep out of his way tonight." Walking and talking trees is definitely reminiscent of some other fantasy story that you probably are aware of. But I really enjoyed the tension that's immediately there. Phantastes, for being such an old and kind of dry book, I don't mean to be offensive to it, it does well, though, to hit multiple registers, even if the ancient prose kind of make it a bit difficult to be immersed in that scene. A lot of the story is Anodos wondering if he ever can or will leave fairyland. Not even the residences that he asks know how to do it. And Anodos frequently is kind of back and forth in his mind between whether or not he believes fairyland is actually real. The prose are an interesting talking point in a book this old and this far removed from what modern fantasy readers expect. We get many long descriptions of Anodos journeying through fairyland. The paragraphs are blocks of text, hundreds of words. They go on for pages sometimes. The prose are sometimes lyrical, but they also have problems. The word choice is often strange and kind of uber technical, in my opinion. Specificity is like the key to writing good prose. But Phantastes often confuses specificity with just exactness. I listened to the audiobook doing this, which was a good read, but it did kind of reveal to my ear some of the clunkiness of the prose. I'm pretty certain even C.S. Lewis said that MacDonald, for all the love he had of his stories, was not really a craftsman in the general sense. This is even further emphasized by how riddled the story is with endless songs and poetry and epigraphs at the beginning of chapters that just go on and on and on, and don't honestly say a lot. This is definitely one of the elements a modern reader would probably not enjoy Phantastes for. I think you could skip most of these. I do like some songs though. The best one happens about 2/3 of the way through, the Song of Sir Aglavel. That's my favorite one. But most of them are not entirely needed and kind of stack the page count, even in a pretty short book. All of these problems kind of attributed to my slow reading, kind of rushing the reading in that 15 to 40% mark of the book, which in my opinion is the worst section of the novel. From this point, once Anodos is in fairyland, the story becomes slow and episodic. The story kind of cycles endlessly between him walking through the forest, meeting some new resident, being a guest at their hut or cottage, having a song or story, and leaving the next morning. He goes to an unfathomable amount of huts and cottages in this story. It doesn't help the fact that these locations and the scenery that you see rarely changes. Your mind's just kind of filled with the same recurring image of forest, river, hut, forest again, I think the slow and repetitive plot is probably the number one thing I wish I could change about this story. It's not that nothing ever happens. If you gave a summary of the story, you'd actually be like, well, it's kind of eventful, more eventful than you might imagine. It's just that he never really gives much attention to when things actually do happen. Even the climactic action scenes at the end of the book are written with such sparseness. It's kind of like, okay, we fight, and we won, and then some of us died, and it's really sad. It's like that kind of writing. The book isn't about action, obviously, but it wouldn't hurt if the action that's in it was better. Same applies with the very wooden side characters and kind of meandering plot. Even if MacDonald never intended to have a fast-paced action, gripping twists or something like that, doesn't mean I can't judge it for not having other versions of those things. The book could have been improved if those things were either remedied or improved upon. Overall, I do think he accomplishes most of what he wanted to do, but potential when reviewing books like this is an important feature to remind yourself of all the time. And Phantastes has a lot more potential than I think it often delivers. This can obviously be seen by the legion of books that took influence from it. If you think about it, influence basically means I like this thing, but I can probably improve upon it in some way. Want Lord of the Rings world building to be more dangerous and thrilling? Boom, you have A Song of Ice and Fire. Want Phantastes, but accessible for all ages? More fun, yet still having the same kind of Christian allegorical themes? There's Narnia. But you have to give credit to Phantastes for being an excellent base for the fantasy genre to kind of grow out of. It's been remembered and copied for centuries at this point. But despite all of this, the slow progression of the story does allow the reader to kind of enter Anodos' subconscious right here a lot. And it's his progression and kind of spiritual pilgrimage that is the actual plot of the story. Now, unfortunately, Anodos is not a very strong character, at least to read about. His voice is either dry or actually kind of annoying. The only personality trait I could really think about for Anodos is simpy and kind of cringe. His whole mission is to track down and kind of woo the Marble Lady, a statue woman he finds and awakens from her slumber. His inner monologue is riddled with the intense desire for the Marble Lady. Modern readers would find his devotion a little bit insane, and that's because it kind of is. Another issue that is plaguing the story is the side characters, which are somehow even more bland and emotionless. At least Anodos If I don't love his personality, at least I know he has one. Most of the characters, and this is probably a product of the time, operate more as thematic symbols and kind of representations of ideas than pure people in their own regard. That could be attributed to the fairyland kind of dream nature of the place, as it's all happening kind of in Anodos' mind, but still. Think NPCs in a video game like Skyrim or something that are just meant there to have like a little dialogue wheel that they cycle through the main character, giving him a bit of information and then having him go on his way. That's kind of how it felt. But thankfully at this point in the story, Anodos does something very stupid. He ignores the warnings of pretty much every single person in Fairyland and stumbles into the shadow. And in my opinion, the shadow is one of, if not the best parts of the book. It's not a shadow like a Dark Lord that you might see in, Lord of the Rings or something. It's a literal shadow, like a shadow that follows behind him, you know what I mean? But it's the effect that this shadow has on Anodos that really makes this story. It's written with such anger and thematic tension and just general despair. It's kind of a blanket of nihilism and darkness in fairyland, which should be very beautiful to Anodos. I've seen many people talk about the shadow as representing kind of Anodos' sins. I think that makes sense for like kind of the Christian vibe of the story. But on a more literal note, I think the shadow actually perfectly symbolizes depression and mental health problems. The shadow clings to him like some kind of smog around him. The story goes on about how it saps his joy and interestingly makes him rationalize his sadness as just being realistic. Like it's a very cool way how it's described, where Fairyland is this nostalgic, cool place that before in the story Anodos really loves, but when the shadow is upon him, he kind of enters this mentality of like, oh no, I don't want to be deceived by Fairyland anymore. I want to see it for what it really is. It's not as great as I used to think. It's not as great as everyone thinks it is. He says he sees the truth in Fairyland and will not be deceived. But the problem is that Fairyland is beautiful and he's supposed to see it that way. He's supposed to let his realism drop and just enter this kind of childlike wonder at this enchanted location he's entered. But the shadow takes that from him. It's something that we see in the modern world where nobody feels wonder or whimsy anymore. Everything is so self-serious. And everyone has no problem calling or even just identifying as himself as like a pessimistic person or a nihilist, And I think Phantastes is a warning against that mentality. Seeing all the beauty in the world rather than using nihilism as a protection from all the pain and trauma that you have. Wasn't life better as a child? Yes, there was less responsibilities and you lived in ignorance and everything was new to you, of course. But what is stopping you from flicking that switch today? Is the world outside your window truly so colorless as you believe it to be? When was the last time you truly played? Played like a child does. Jumped a puddle, climbed a tree, or picked your favorite leaf from a tree just to do it. I think that's what Fairyland is supposed to represent. It's not just a place of whimsy, of course. There is darkness and sadness, goblins and giants, and a long, hard road. And Anodos, our main character, is burdened with this kind of ever-present shadow he can't get rid of. But it is also beautiful, full of nature, full of places to go and people to meet. Despite it being some dream reality where the trees are conscious and fairies live in the flowers, it's not such an unbelievable place. It's not very different from our real world. And maybe Fairyland is outside your door right now. And despite if you have a shadow or not, it's gonna be there. And it always will be. The shadow follows Anodos throughout his journeys, specifically to the palace, where we enter the best part of the novel, in my opinion. Here is where we talk about Cosmo's story. I think people who have read this book will be like, yes, this is the part, and everyone who hasn't read it will be like, this sounds kind of weird. Because Cosmo's story is an intermission in the story. It's a story within a story. Anodos goes to this palace, enters this kind of like cool library setting, and reads from two of the books. The first story he reads is a little bit wonky to me, but the second, Cosmo's story, is amazing. Having a story within a story at this place in the novel without really any setup kind of feels weird, but it does work. It almost acts as the heart of the novel. Cosmo is a poor man from Prague, a real life place in the world, and his story is about him buying a mirror and bringing it home. Once he dusts off the mirror, he finds a reflection of a beautiful pale woman there, trapped inside it. The woman is at first dormant, without her eyes open, but over the course of the short story she wakes up, though she cannot seem to hear or see Cosmo. The progression aspect of her becoming more conscious is wonderfully handled, in my opinion. Like Anodos and his marble lady he's constantly chasing after throughout the whole of the novel, Cosmo wants nothing more than to free the mirror lady. He kind of has this almost same obsessive reverence towards her. Cosmo himself serves as kind of a mirror to Anodos, and the mirror lady serves as a mirror to the marble lady. Without really spoiling the story, his obsession and love of the mirror lady is treated by MacDonald as a noble thing, and it reveals Fairyland's design for Anodos, even if he doesn't know it yet. This internal story is long, a decent 25 pages or so, but it is very compelling. In a book that left me kind of straight-faced for most of it, this is definitely the one that got the most emotion out of me. Part of me actually wishes there's an entire book about Cosmo. It just seems like such an interesting idea. But I wouldn't want to replace Phantastes. I would just want another side story about him. It's such a wonderful little built package, a little treat in the center of this otherwise massive fantasy book that perfectly ties in the characters, the atmosphere, a striking fantasy visual of the woman in the mirror, and the overall theme of the entire novel. Phantastes is significant for two reasons, in my opinion. The first is the atmosphere of Fairyland. That's kind of what you came here for. That's what was revolutionary about Fairyland back in the day. But the second is the meaningful allegories that are littered throughout the story. Regardless of the somewhat shitty character writing, the slow plot, and the somewhat alternative world-building style, you can't deny that the use of imagery, allegory, and themes are really well handled. Specifically his use of symbols such as the shadow, the marble lady, Cosmo and his mirror, and the idea of Fairyland as a whole work wonders for thematic resonance. The story of Phantastes, of Anodos' trials, feel like kind of some spiritual pilgrimage. And even if it's very subtle and the book never really makes you feel it that much, the stakes are Anodos' soul itself. His name means pathless in Latin, or Greek, one of them. And that really begins to make sense here once you're nearing the end of the book. Since his upbringing was one of luxury but passionlessness, Fairyland gives Anodos the opportunity for limitless clarity, where he can test himself, go on adventures, and hopefully transcend his problems and return to the world as a better person. But only by identifying and tackling these problems will he be able to actually leave the place. That's how he leaves Fairyland. His journey takes him to many more places across Fairyland, many more huts, many more rivers, many more forests, of course, and ultimately all the way to the ending of the story, which I will not spoil. The ending is controversial to many, though, probably because of the standards of modern fantasy it's being held to. Personally, based on what I've read from that time and from what more educated people have told me, the ending is actually pretty standard for the time. You have to always remind yourself when reading this book that despite it being called a fantasy, the birth of the fantasy genre, it's really structured more as a spiritual pilgrimage rather than some blockbuster fantasy novel. The revolutionary aspect about Phantastes is the fantastical world building and the seriousness in which it uses its fantasy elements. It treats them with adult seriousness, where in the time, that kind of was a bit of an oddity. But the story isn't some fun fantasy romp like The Hobbit, nor some pulp action flick like Conan. Overall, I do enjoy the ending, even if for the first time I was a little bit confused by it. I had to kind of reread it. I think thematically it ties everything together, and for a spiritual ascension book like this, that's kind of what is important. But does that mean it's a great story everyone should read? Should you read Phantastes? I'll say that if you're a modern fantasy reader, of course you're going to have to change your expectations a little bit. It's not going to be one that's going to keep you up till 3 a.m. reading unless it, hits you in some massive way. And I will say personally, despite the somewhat poor character work, the meanderingness of the plot, and far too many dry songs in my opinion, though I do enjoy some songs, Phantastes does succeed in where it counts. Thematically, it is kind of a gold mine, especially in modern fantasy landscapes where themes are kind of the backdrop. This one you can clearly tell, and he went in with an intention to say something. From the weight of Anodos' internal sins, the representation of mental health, and the unbeauty of nihilistic realism, all are represented by Anodos' trailing shadow. The desire, pursuit, and idealization of feminine beauty shown by Anodos' quest for ownership of the Marble Lady, all the way to what I deem to be the true moral of the story, best shown in Cosmo's story and the Battle of the Knights and the Giants at the end. And that is choosing not to be greedy, choosing to forsake your own desires for others. Selflessness. It's a universal theme of stories, and it's done well here in my opinion. I know now that it is by loving and not by being loved that one can come nearest to the soul of another. It is the loving of each other and not the being loved by each other that originates and perfects and assures their blessedness. 1858's Phantastes was an interesting read. The first read on my great fantasy reading journey. Book one of probably 500. As the birthplace of fantasy, I could see so many tropes and themes and kind of ideas that began here that would go on to define many elements of the fantasy genre from here on out. It is a hard read, but an important one for the most part. Despite some serious challenges, does hold up. I am giving Phantastes a 5.8 out of 10. Or 3 stars. Just above an average score. For a book this old and this detached from modern reader expectations, I do think that's a pretty respectable score. It feels right that the first review on this channel should be close to the average. You know, I didn't plan that, of course. As for me, I am currently reading another George MacDonald book, The Light Princess. But the next review I'll be doing on this channel will be a big one, Alice in Wonderland. That is coming next, so I hope you check it out. Like and subscribe if you like the video. Anyways, guys, ciao.